So we're starting the run up to Easter today as we lead into what are called the Passion narratives. That is passion as in suffering, not passion as in loving. When we talk about Passiontide, it means suffering, and it's about Jesus suffering. And here is the beginning. Jesus is arrested, John chapter 18. So effectively, we're starting Lent one Sunday early, but that's not a problem. We're coming back to John's Gospel. We left off John's Gospel at the end of chapter 17 some time ago. So let me remind you what we've seen in John's Gospel so far very quickly. Here we are. The beginning of John's Gospel, we have the prologue. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. That's followed by witness and revelation in chapters 1 to 4. Chapters 5 to 8, a growing conflict with religious leaders as Jesus teaches and gets their backs up. Chapters 9 to 12, ministry among believers. And then chapters 13 to 17, those glorious, precious passages, chapters of Jesus in the upper room with his disciples, teaching them. And now we come to chapter 18 with Jesus' arrest. Let me remind you that John is always careful with his words. Not one word is wasted. Every word carefully chosen. And when we understand that, we can begin to see some of the links and the threads that John is making within this narrative of his gospel account. We see that there are links with other parts of the Bible. They are all over the place. We don't necessarily spot them first time through, but the more you look, the more you see them. The very way he starts his gospel in the beginning is exactly the same as Genesis 1, in the beginning. A link with what had gone before. When Jesus talks about being the good shepherd, you may not be aware of it, but that's picking up on Ezekiel. I think it's Ezekiel 34, where Ezekiel talks about the good shepherd. Jesus says, I am that good shepherd. Just two examples, and there are many more. But John not only links with the Bible, he links with the culture that's around him. The very term that he uses, the name he chooses to give Jesus, the Son of God, the term logos that many of you will have heard of, that's a secular term. It's a word that comes from secular philosophy. And John draws it in to say, here is your true logos. Don't look out there. You need to look in here. Other links with culture are there all the way through John's Gospel. Jesus goes to a wedding. What could be more cultural than that? He has supper at somebody's house. He has intimate meetings with his disciples, all picking up on the culture. So as we look at John sewing together the threads of the Bible with the threads of culture, we see through it all the key to understanding all of that is Jesus. There is one key and one only, and it is Jesus. Without Jesus, none of it makes sense. With Jesus, it all slots into place. And in this passage, the Garden of Gethsemane, we see Jesus confronting the world. You'll see how that works a little later on. Jesus confronts the world, and Jesus submits to the world. That is shocking. It's meant to be shocking that God incarnate should submit to the will of sinful humanity. But through that, we'll go on to see, not in this chapter but later on, we'll go on to see that Jesus then saves the world. Confronts the world, submits to the world, and saves the world. So let's get to chapter 18 and ask, first of all, who is Jesus? Who is Jesus? It becomes clear in this chapter, verse 4. Then Jesus, knowing all that would happen to him, came forward and said to them, "Whom do you seek?" They answered him, "Jesus of Nazareth." Jesus said to them, "I am he." Sounds like just a simple answer to a simple question, doesn't it? Who are you looking for? Oh, it's me. But it's much, much more than that. Remember I said every word in John's Gospel is carefully chosen, nothing extraneous. Do you remember when Moses came to God and said, "What's your name? Who sent me?" What did God say? He said, "I am." Jesus here is saying, "I am." Jesus has said, "I am the bread of life," linking with the wilderness journeys. "I am the light of the world," linking with creation. "I am the way, the truth, and the life," what we all need. "I am the true vine," says Jesus, "and now I am he." I am he. For those who will hear, Jesus is claiming to be God. In John chapter 1 verse 14, in the prologue to this gospel, John tells us, "In the beginning was the Word. The Word was with God, and the Word was God." The Word was Jesus. The Word became flesh and lived among us. The Word, "I am he," says Jesus. God with us. One commentator says this: "I'm inclined to think that here there was, for a moment, a little rendering of the veil of his flesh and an emission of some flash of the brightness that always tabernacled within him." Great language, isn't it? A glimpse, just a glimpse of the glory of God in Jesus Christ. No wonder the soldiers fell back, and we'll see that in a moment. So here in this passage, Jesus is none other than God incarnate. God incarnate confronting the world. And the world he confronts is made up of a number of characters. The first of those characters is Judas, the betrayer. Verse 2. Now Judas, who betrayed him, also knew the place, for Jesus often met there with his disciples. So Judas, having procured a band of soldiers and some officers from the chief priests and the Pharisees, went there with lanterns and torches and weapons. Here is Judas, the betrayer. Money was the most important thing to Judas. He'd give anything for a bit of money in his pocket. And he got that. And he'd gone and procured a band of soldiers. We'll think about them in a moment. Just remember who this Judas is, won't you? Remember. To us, Judas the betrayer, the wicked one. But he was one of the 12. He'd shared with Jesus. He'd shared with the other 11 disciples. He'd seen the great miracles that Jesus had performed. He'd heard unparalleled teaching from the mouth of Jesus and seen how he handled the religious leaders. Judas had seen lives changed as they trusted in Jesus. Judas had even been part of a mission team who had gone out to tell the world about Jesus. And there's no reason to think he didn't play his part in that. He lived like a believer. He spoke like a believer. He behaved like a believer. We would not have been able to spot him among the 12. But in the end, the lure of money was too great for him. Given the option, God or wealth, Jesus or money? Judas made what turned out to be a spectacularly bad choice. But that could be any one of us, couldn't it? I don't know anybody's heart, just as you don't know mine. I think the lesson of Judas is a salutary one, and one that should make us all think. So Jesus, confronting the world in the garden, he's met first with Judas, then he's met with the soldiers that Judas brought with him. Now these soldiers, they were just doing their job, weren't they? We see there were a band of soldiers with lanterns and torches and weapons. They'd all come to get Jesus. Led by Judas, they were doing what they were told to do. But when they met Jesus, they found they couldn't do what they were told to do. Jesus said, "I am," and they fell back at the sight of who Jesus was, unable to stand at the very hint of the presence of God. That was too much for them. In the end, they returned and they did arrest Jesus. It's worth remembering that just doing your job is never a defense for bad actions. That goes for secular international law. You can't say, "I was only following orders." You can't say, "I'm not guilty because I was doing what I was told." These soldiers were doing what they were told. They were faced with Jesus, but instead of submitting to him, they arrested him. So Jesus meets with Judas. He meets with the soldiers. Then Peter is an interesting character, isn't he? Verse 10, Simon Peter, having a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's servant and cut off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. Nobody has the first clue why John tells us the servant's name. We do know it's not wasted because John doesn't waste words. It's possible that Malchus or children of Malchus were known in the church when John was writing. That's probably the most likely explanation, so that John was able to say, "See that Malchus there?" Or, "You see Malchus, it was his dad. He had his ear chopped off by Jesus." It lends a sense of reality and truth to what's going on. But here, Peter acted impulsively, and he tried to defend Jesus. That's quite different to what Peter's going to do in a few verses' time, where he'll do just the opposite. But here, he's got that bravado. Maybe it's because he knows he's got Jesus standing there, and he thinks, "Well, I can do this because Jesus will protect me." Maybe. But he tried to defend Jesus. God incarnate needs no defense against human beings. Whatever Peter may think, whatever we may think, God doesn't need our defense. Even against an army of human beings, Jesus is in control. He holds all the power. And as we'll see, he chooses to submit. See, Peter is one who thinks that that God actually needs a little bit of help to do what he wants to do. There are people like that today that don't believe that God can defend himself in culture or wherever it is. He doesn't need our defense. So we've got Judas, we've got the soldiers, we've got Peter, and then we've got all the other disciples. Well, they're not named, and we're not told clearly that they are there, but verse 9 suggests that they probably were. This was to fulfill the word that had been spoken, "Of those whom you gave me, I have lost not one." We don't hear anything from them in this passage, nothing at all. But they trusted Jesus to deal with the situation. They, if you like, hid behind Jesus when the soldiers came, apart from Peter. They let Jesus take the rap for them. They were to go free when Jesus was arrested. That, even at this early stage of the Passion narrative, is a hint of what is yet to come. When Jesus takes on himself the sin of the world. So Jesus meets all types of people. He meets the world in Gethsemane. But why Gethsemane? And what is Gethsemane? Well, Gethsemane is a walled garden. You can go, if you go to Israel today, you can visit what is said to be Gethsemane, and it probably is. And it's a beautiful place with olive trees. It's peaceful. It is quiet. It's a retreat away from the crowds. It's a place of peace and tranquility. That's why Jesus went there. For a rest. To get away from the crowds that were mobbing him. But in this instance, when Jesus went there, that place of peace became a place of danger. It became a place of rebellion and sin and the actions of sinful human beings. Jesus knew that when he went there, but he freely went in full knowledge, not trying to escape, but in obedience to his Father. This is what the Father wanted him to do. So despite the cost, he did it. And in order to get from God's city, Jerusalem, to the Garden of Gethsemane, you go through a valley. And at the bottom of the valley is a brook that flows in the rainy season, and it's called Kidron, the brook Kidron. Now, there's not really much time to go into this, but look up the Kidron Valley in the Old Testament. It has a mass of history. It is a place where abominations are dumped in the Kidron Valley. When Josiah reformed Israel, when he found the Bible, he found a book of the law, and he brought reforms, he threw all the abominations out, ground them up into the Kidron Valley. Solomon gave a man called Shimei, you'll have to look this up, gave a man called Shimei a home in Jerusalem, and he said, don't leave your home. Just listen to this verse. This is from 1 Kings. For on the day you go out and cross the brook Kidron, know for certain that you shall die. Your blood shall be on your own head. I wonder if Jesus had that verse in his mind as he went from Jerusalem to Gethsemane across the Kidron Valley. From God's place to a garden. And here's another link with the Bible that John is hinting at here. Life began in a garden. Sin began in a garden. Genesis chapter 3. And now sin is to be defeated, starting in a garden. But there's one more character that we've not yet looked at, and that is Caiaphas. Look at verse 14. It was Caiaphas who'd advised the Jews that it would be expedient that one man should die for the people. Here is Caiaphas, an interesting character, Caiaphas, isn't he? High priest, but really seeking his own ends, not seeking God. In a very senior position in the religious day, among religious people of the day, very senior position. But he cared only for himself. And yet, out of his mouth came a word of prophecy, prophetic explanation, that one man should die for the people. That's what Jesus was going to do. That's interesting, isn't it? So Jesus meets the world in the Garden of Gethsemane. He meets Judas, who betrayed him. He meets the soldiers who arrested him. He's confronted by Peter with his sword. He has the disciples with him. He is arrested and he's taken. When we look at this chapter, or this first part of this chapter, these first 14 verses, we are moving towards the cross, which is the pinnacle of where John is getting in his gospel. Here we see that Jesus is associating himself with the rebellious world. The world that doesn't want to know him. The world that is out to get him. The world that pretends to know him. He confronts all types of people. Judas, who opposed him. Indifference from the soldiers. Those who think God needs defending. And those who are his own disciples. All this in a garden. And it's all God's plan. God's plan to put right what had gone wrong, to offer a new start to any who will trust him. Any of those soldiers or other people in the garden could have said, "Okay, Jesus, I trust you, I'll join your disciples." But they didn't. Jesus offers forgiveness of sin, freedom from guilt for those who trust him. And we'll see that more and more as we get through these wonderful chapters. As we come to a close, I'm going to pray in just a moment, but just think carefully for yourself. Which do you most associate with? Hopefully it's the disciples. But is it perhaps one of the others? If it's one of the others, then you've got something to sort out, haven't you? Let's bow our heads to pray.